At my sister's wedding, her father-in-law walked right past me twice. No hello, no glance, just silence. 4 hours later, I said one sentence and he turned pale. That's when everything shifted. But before that moment, before the silence broke, I stood at the edge of a world that had quietly decided I didn't belong. Let me take you back, because stories like this don't begin with shock. They begin with quiet disappointments. No one notices but you. I almost didn't go to the wedding, not out of spite, just weariness. You see, my sister and I used to be close. Madeline, the golden child, the loudest laugh in every room. When we were young, she braided my hair for school, made up silly songs to make me laugh when I cried over lost pencils or scraped knees. But something changed when we grew older. She floated into popularity, into society, into the kind of circles that care more about appearance than presence. And me, I took a quieter path, built something slowly, something solid, a startup, then a second. Long nights, bad coffee, one failed launch, and then traction. By the time my name appeared in the footer of contracts, her texts had already grown cold. We stopped talking not because of a fight, but because our lives no longer intersected. She didn't ask, and I stopped offering. Then, one afternoon, the invitation arrived. Cream cardstock, gold-foiled letters. Madeline and Grant, it read. My name handwritten near the bottom. No note, no call, just the assumption that I'd show up and smile politely. I read it 3 times. A part of me wanted to throw it away. Another part of me wanted to go, if only to prove to myself that I could walk into a room full of people who overlooked me and still hold my head high. In the end, I chose silence over pride. I RSVP'd yes. Alone. The day of the wedding, I wore a slate-gray dress that didn't beg for attention. I arrived early out of habit, not nerves. No one greeted me. No one looked up. At the welcome table, the hostess squinted at my name as if it were foreign. She found the card, handed it over without a smile, and turned to the next guest before I could thank her. I scanned the room. Gold chairs, hanging orchids, a string quartet playing something elegant. And there she was, Madeline, my sister. Radiant in lace, floating past like a bride in a magazine spread. She didn't stop, didn't wave. I smiled to myself, not out of sadness, just recognition. This was the version of her I had expected. I found my seat, table 19, near the swinging kitchen doors. Every few minutes, they flapped open with the clang of plates and murmurs of staff. No centerpiece, no familiar faces, just me and 2 guests who politely kept to their own conversation. That was the first message, but the second came minutes later. He walked past me like I wasn't there, tall, silver-haired, confident in a navy suit worth more than my first car. Roland Rowe, the groom's father. A man who wore legacy like cologne. He didn't see me. No, he chose not to. He walked right by. Twice. Looked over my head, turned his shoulder slightly as if blocking me from his line of sight. No hello, no glance. Just silence, but I knew who he was. The real question was, did he know who I was? Not yet, but soon. Table 19. No one ever says it out loud, but there's a hierarchy at weddings. It's mapped in inches how close you are to the couple, the centerpieces, the dance floor. Mine was closest to the kitchen. Every time the doors flapped open, a gust of hot air brushed past my shoulder. I caught glimpses of trays stacked high, chefs shouting over timing, and staff slipping in and out like ghosts. No candles on my table, no name I recognized, just silverware clinking and polite nods from strangers who didn't ask how I knew the bride. I didn't mind. After all, I had been underestimated before. But this time felt different. This time, I wasn't just an invisible guest. I was a symbol of a story no one in that ballroom had read yet. Across the room, the Rowe family was encircled in light. Grant the groom stood flanked by his uncles, all wearing matching navy and the same self-assurance. Roland laughed loudly, talking with his hands, commanding attention like a man used to owning the room. And still, not once did he glance my way. He had walked by earlier, close enough to smell the bourbon in his glass. He glanced at my name tag for half a second, then moved on. Dismissal is rarely loud. The cruelest form is silent, polished, and perfectly intentional. He didn't see a threat, didn't see anyone, and that made this all the more poetic. 36 hours earlier, I was in a quiet glass conference room 5 states away. A 3-hour negotiation had ended with one signature mine. Through a set of clean legal structures and quiet holding companies, my firm had acquired the majority supplier for Rowe Consolidated's infrastructure projects. A small move on paper, a massive shift beneath the surface. Roland didn't know, not yet. He wouldn't see the impact until Monday when his procurement team would log in to find new protocols, new contracts, new approval chains. He'd scroll down through the documents, and in the footer, see the same name printed on the card he just ignored. Mine. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and brushed against the edge of my business card case. Just one small, embossed rectangle of paper. It wasn't revenge I felt, just stillness. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone, but there's a certain kind of quiet satisfaction in watching the world rearrange itself without raising your voice. I stirred my coffee. The music swelled as courses changed. Servers flowed like a tide. Madeline never looked my way, not once. A woman at a nearby table leaned in to whisper to her friend. "That's Mr. Rowe, right? Roland Rowe. The one who owns half the East Coast trucking lanes." Her friend nodded, eyes wide with awe. I smiled barely. Roland didn't own those lanes anymore, not all of them. By Tuesday, his board would be calling an emergency, meeting to discuss a strategic realignment with a new tech partner. A partner who just happened to be sitting beside the kitchen, sipping quietly while the chandeliers glittered in someone else's honor. They tapped their glasses, the music dimmed, the clink of silver stilled. Roland Rowe stood, tall and composed, raising his champagne flute. The toast was about to begin, and with it the beginning of the end. The room went still. All eyes turned to Roland Rowe as he lifted his glass. He didn't need a microphone. Some men carry their own gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth, rehearsed, "tonight we celebrate more than a union between two people. We celebrate legacy." There it was, the word he loved most, legacy. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the crystal and candlelight blur. His voice echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, each sentence laced with pride. "In this marriage, our two families combine strength with strength, a foundation of heritage, discipline, and vision." He looked at Madeline and Grant. They smiled like catalog models, beautiful, curated, distant. "Rowe Consolidated has always stood for endurance," he continued. "Through decades, through markets rising and falling, through wars and winters. And we've stood tall thanks to partnerships built on trust. Loyalty." Ah, there it was, loyalty. I took a slow sip of water and said nothing. Because just 36 hours ago, one of those loyal partners had quietly sold their stake. To me, the irony wasn't lost on me. The man giving a speech about legacy had no idea he was standing on ground that had already shifted beneath him. He spoke of secure channels, of relationships measured in decades, of unshakable networks. Words meant to impress. Words meant to reassure the room of his continued relevance. But the room didn't know the truth yet, that a new player had entered the map, not with a splash, but with silence. Me. Vierks Tech, my firm, wasn't flashy. We didn't court headlines. We didn't beg for attention. We simply moved efficiently, quietly into key positions. The kind of strategic acquisitions that take years to build and one signature to finalize. And the deal that closed Friday, it made Vierks the single most vital node in Rowe Consolidated's supply network. Logistics, routing tech, data infrastructure. Everything his empire relied on to deliver product from warehouse to coast now flowed through systems we controlled. And yet here I sat next to the kitchen, uninvited to speak, unacknowledged, Perfect. He ended the toast with a flourish. To love, to family, and to futures forged in trust. Everyone raised their glasses. I didn't. Not in protest, just in preference. Because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't just a celebration. It was a countdown. In 40 hours, his executive assistant would forward a memo about vendor priority restructuring. In 41 hours, Roland Rowe would see my name printed at the bottom of a Tier 1 compliance request. And in that moment, he'd realize the girl seated by the kitchen wasn't just someone he forgot to greet. She was the one who'd just rewritten his future. I folded my napkin, not dramatically, just deliberately, because the next move, it would be quiet, precise, and irreversible. Dessert had just been served. Something delicate panna cotta with sugared petals, I think. I barely touched it. Instead, I excused myself. Not dramatically. Not to make a scene. Just to stand, stretch, and breathe somewhere with less crystal and performance. Roland was by the fireplace again, surrounded by men with matching suits and aged ambition. They laughed that expensive kind of laughter, the kind that's rehearsed after too many years in rooms like these. I waited. I've learned that silence can disarm more than confrontation. So I stood just close enough to be noticed, and then said, quietly, "Mr. Rowe." He turned. For a brief moment, I could see the gears in his mind ticking, trying to place the face, the name tag, the context. I smiled gently. "I believe we're scheduled to speak Monday morning." A pause, his brow furrowed, polite confusion taking shape. "I'm sorry, which firm are you with?" I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out one clean business card, and handed it to him. He glanced, then blinked, then really looked. And that's when it happened. The color drained from his face slowly, like ink seeping from a page. His hand stiffened around the card. "Lucian Trent," I said softly. "COO, Vierks Tech." I didn't need to say anything else. The dots were already connecting themselves inside his head violently. The contract, the Friday deadline, the infrastructure integration, the emails he skimmed, the PDF he signed, the assumptions he made. "You've been emailing with me all week." He didn't speak, just stood there, still holding the card like it had burned his fingers. I watched as he replayed every moment of the day through a different lens. The ignored glance, the dismissal, the seating arrangement. And now the realization that the future of his legacy was now partially tethered to someone he hadn't even bothered to acknowledge. Not because I didn't matter, but because he decided I didn't. I didn't realize he began finally, but I raised a hand. "That's all right. Most people don't." My tone was calm, measured. Like the signature I had placed on his future 2 days ago. He straightened his jacket. The men behind him watched with curiosity, now their laughter fading, their attention turning. I nodded politely. "We'll speak Monday. Have a good evening, Mr. Rowe." And I turned and walked away, not fast, not proud. Just centered. I didn't look back, because I didn't need to. Some moments echo without volume, and that was one of them. He would remember it, not because I embarrassed him, but because I didn't need to. I returned to my table without ceremony. The panna cotta was melting slowly. My coffee had gone cold. The servers moved in rhythmic patterns, clearing plates and resetting wine glasses as if the world hadn't just tilted. But I could feel it. The current. Something in the air had changed. Not loud, not obvious, but very, very real. Roland didn't return to his conversation. He stood still for too long, hands folded, brows furrowed, eyes distant. The men around him, men who moments ago had laughed like kings, now glanced at him sideways, unsure why his color had drained. And then their eyes followed his, to me just sitting there, alone, at table 19. And suddenly the narrative began to shift. A woman 3 tables over leaned toward her husband. "Is that Lucian Trent?" she mouthed. He frowned. "The one from the Vierks acquisition." Another guest at a nearby table turned, not discreetly, and looked at my badge, whispered something, then widened his eyes, and then it spread. Whispers like ivy crept through the room. The woman by the kitchen. She's the one who controls the infrastructure contract. She's the name on the papers Roland just signed. She's the person no one greeted and everyone now wanted to. People turned. Some subtle, some not. I didn't meet their eyes. I didn't need to. I just stirred my coffee slowly and watched the chandeliers flicker overhead, catching pieces of gold in the glass. It was fascinating watching a room recalibrate in real time. The same people who looked through me 2 hours ago were now trying to remember if they had smiled at me, if they had said hello, if they had made a mistake. They had, but I wasn't going to fix it for them. The Rowe family table grew quiet. Grant, my sister's new husband, looked toward me with a puzzled expression, as if trying to remember why his bride hadn't spoken to me all evening. Madeline was still radiant in white. But she, too, had gone still. I saw her glance across the room at Roland, then at me. Confusion crept into her expression, and behind it something else. Regret, recognition, too early to tell. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and checked the time. The wedding was only halfway through, and yet, somehow, I'd already become the most unforgettable moment in the room. Not because I stood up and made a speech. Not because I called anyone out, but because I hadn't. People remember silence differently when it holds power. She found me just as I was about to leave. The ballroom had softened. The music, slower now. Guests drifting toward the dance floor or disappearing into champagne and small talk. I stood quietly near the corridor, waiting for my coat when she approached. Madeline, still in her gown, still breathtaking. But closer now, the illusion wavered. Her bouquet drooped slightly. Her lipstick had faded at the corners. And her eyes, the same green-gray ones we shared, held something I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability. "You could have told me," she said. No anger, no edge. Just that hollow tone you use when you're realizing a story was unfolding right next to you, and you never thought to ask. I turned to face her. The sister who once taught me how to paint butterflies on notebook paper. The sister who, once upon a time, promised we'd never grow apart. But we had. And it wasn't just life or distance. It was choices. Hers to rise in circles that prized surface over substance. Mine to build quietly, steadily, far from the spotlight she clung to. "You never asked," I replied. Simple. Not cruel, just true. She looked down. The silence between us felt heavier than the music. "I didn't know you were someone like that," she said softly. And there it was. That familiar pause. That moment people search for a word important, successful, powerful, but don't want to admit they'd never seen it in you before. I raised an eyebrow. "Worthy of a better seat?" I asked. "Of an introduction." She flinched just barely. I wasn't trying to wound her, only to hold up a mirror. "I didn't expect this," she whispered. I nodded. "Neither did I. But here we are." She stared at me for the first time, really stared. Like trying to recognize a sibling inside a stranger wearing poise. I didn't mean to, but I held up a hand, gently. "You didn't mean not to either." She bit her lip, eyes glistening, and I could tell there was more. 1,000 little apologies wrapped in years of silence. But the wedding was still humming behind us. And this wasn't the place for rewinds. Some wounds don't scar with words. They just slowly close, or they don't. She reached out, fingers grazing my wrist for a second, then pulled back, and said nothing more. Neither did I. We stood there for a moment, not as sisters, not yet. Just two women on opposite sides of something we never named. Then she turned back toward the reception. I watched her go, still beautiful, still slightly wilted. And maybe, just maybe, finally awake. I left before the last dance. Not in a rush, not in bitterness, just ready. Some exits don't need fanfare. They just need to be yours. I slipped my coat over my shoulders, nodded to the valet, and stepped out into the evening air. It was cooler than expected. The kind of air that sobers you from glitter and noise and reminds you who you are without the music. I glanced back once. Not to make sure anyone saw me leave, but to remind myself how far I'd come. Behind those walls was a ballroom full of people who had measured me in silence, who had seen a woman near the kitchen and assumed she had nothing to say, who'd forgotten that power doesn't always arrive with sound. In that room, Roland Rowe would be wondering how he missed the signs. He'd scroll through his inbox that night, find my name in signatures, in subject lines, and realize it was always there. Madeline would glance around the reception, searching for me too late. And maybe she'd begin to ask herself real questions about seats, about names, about the way we recognize family only after the cameras are off. The valet handed me my keys. He smiled warmly. Probably didn't know who I was, didn't need to, because outside that ballroom my name didn't need defending. It simply existed. Lucian Trent. The signature at the bottom of the contract. The ghost in the boardroom. The guest no one expected. I got into my car, rolled down the window halfway. The music inside had swelled again, something soft, something rehearsed. But the real crescendo had already passed, and only a few people would ever know it. I checked the mirror, not for makeup, not for vanity, just for closure. Behind me, chandeliers, linen, lace, and the lesson. Ahead of me, open road, open sky, and peace. Because some victories aren't loud. They don't involve slamming doors or shouting names. They don't require you to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away on your own terms, unshaken, unbothered, and finally unmissable.